I'm going to approach this main topic by focusing on the nexus between the Gramscian notions of cultural hegemony and of the status and role of intellectuals of various kinds, traditional, organic, alienated. I also want to have as an underlying point that there are important distinctions as well as overlaps between popular and democratic. The latter includes the capacity, knowledge, and the inclination for critical evaluation of evidence and values, in our context, those that have been applied to Greek and Roman antiquity, particularly concepts such as exemplary and cultural authority. I also want to acknowledge the value of comparanda from different times and places. This brings into the discussion the effects of changes in class structures and migration patterns. These not only affect public perceptions of and access to Greek and Roman material, they also influence how scholars and creative practitioners work within and against traditions, and how they experiment to achieve their distinctive aspirations. Ancient texts and ideas can be catalysts for the cultural imaginary, and I'll return to that later. In the concluding part of my talk, I want to identify some possible directions for the future, suggesting that study and critical understanding of Greek and Roman antiquity can play a part in a new and more aspirational cosmopoiesis that might enable Gramsci's organic intellectual to avoid the more destructive effects of alienation, both in the subject area itself and in the wider world. And I'll start with just a few comments on what might be involved in democratizing the study and understanding of Greek and Roman antiquity. There's a cluster of focal points in this debate. I think the most important of these include, firstly, the history of the subject area itself, especially the ways in which knowledge about the Greek and Roman world dominated cultural values and discourses in the West, setting agendas for content, which authors, which texts, and for how that knowledge was used. For example, in determining access to higher education, and from there to the civil service, the professions, and politics. Chris Stray's groundbreaking study of the relationship between schools, universities, and society in England in the 19th century and in the first 2/3 of the 20th century documented the associations between study of the classics, social values, and the exercise of power, as well as identifying the strains to which it was subjected. Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital, that is, power built up and sustained through elite education and a cultural framework of values and discourse shared among the privileged, is one way of generalizing about the status of the classical club among a predominantly male and almost exclusively white governing class. Now, there were, it is true, some limited opportunities for outsiders to access this. Routes varied from the autodidacts among working class people in the 19th and 20th centuries, including those acquiring classical knowledge through the grammar school routes, which opened up in the second part of the 20th century, of which more later. Then there were the ways in which radical thinkers and creative practitioners in the arts have deployed Greek and Roman material as a basis for critique and for experimental exploration of alternative ways of understanding the past, the present, and the future. I think especially here of the work of poets and dramatists such as Derek Walcott, Seamus Heaney, and Tony Harrison, all of whom I'll refer to later. The processes of critique and creativity are rather different for scholars, whether they work in schools or in universities, but I do think there are significant areas of overlap as well as symbiosis between scholarship and creativity. A recent webinar organised by Sportula Europe in collaboration with the London Committee for Classicists of Colour earlier in this month included some pertinent remarks from participants about how teachers and lecturers might find that in order to be in a position to push for more radical initiatives, it was necessary first to be aligned with the more conservative or establishment structures. In other words, to retreat or to aspire into becoming what Gramsci designated as traditional intellectuals. This dilemma is also reflected in the questions that might be asked about the effects on scholarship when, for example, women, working class people, and people of colour become participants in a subject area which had been primarily led by white male elite figures. Is the model predominantly one of assimilation? That is, are these novae conditioned in the values, curriculum, working methods, and aspirations of the community of scholars that they have joined? And I've touched on this in my contribution to the Festschrift that was recently published in honour of Christopher Stray. A great deal more research will be needed over the coming years to document and then evaluate what changes, if any, result from this increased inclusivity. Evidence might include changes in curricula, teaching methods, trajectories of outreach, priorities and means of public engagement, and especially the kinds of research questions that are posed and the methods deployed to tackle them. I live in hope that Chris Stray will pursue this branch of the history of scholarship with his usual archival expertise and detective-like tenacity. So please help me to persuade him to take it on. Then we need to ask, what are the underlying aspirations involved in democratizing the study and understanding of ancient Greece and Rome? The title of this talk implies that in order to democratize, subaltern perspectives and voices that have been excluded or marginalized have to be brought to the center and empowered so that not only are they heard, they also make a difference. And there's a big contrast between those two things. A difference not only to themselves, but to others within the classics community and beyond it. So what or who is the subaltern in this context? Is it a status that is imposed by the prevailing hegemony? Or is it self-selected, even welcomed by its constituent groups? And I'm mindful here of Alice Walker's insight that losing power involves saying and thinking that you haven't got any. The question is at the center of Gramsci's notion that the organic intellectual seeks to win consent to counter hegemonic ideas and ambitions. Now, hierarchies that are recognized in other spheres of cultural politics don't necessarily work in the context that we are addressing in this workshop. Just to give an example, in the UK context, English is a subaltern language, given the problems of acquiring the necessary expertise in reading Greek and Latin texts in the original language, and the generally subaltern status of translation in general, although it is now getting a more appreciative and more detailed consideration. Moreover, within modern languages themselves, there's a further hierarchy of status involving attitudes to and the reach of vernaculars, dialects, and idioms. Those are factors that subalterns who become intellectuals in classical studies have to deal with. Now, I have two main concerns about the current approach to inclusivity. Firstly, how best to recognize that some sort of what might be called identity scholarship will be at play, at least initially, in shaping how new and existing members of the profession address these issues. And yet at the same time, there seems to me to be a need to resist the temptation to assume a kind of essentialism, whether of gender, ethnicity, class, or indeed any other factor. An essentialism that constrains and directs the sensibilities and the cognitive trajectories of any group in any particular direction. To fall into this era of essentialism would not only be patronizing, but would impoverish the potential of the subject area to develop the kind of critical humanism that's necessary for the future. And in my contribution to the Stray Festschrift, I did make a very cautious and I think too limited attempt to get this kind of issue onto the agenda. There are other hierarchical issues that affect classical study in a rapidly fragmenting social and cultural environment. I should note that government attitudes to the study of classical subjects, also increasingly evident in Europe and the United States, are paradoxical in the United Kingdom, in that the government says that classics is among the non-instrumental and therefore dead-end subjects, and so aims to reduce its availability in the maintained schools and colleges at least, and thus restrict access to it as a university subject of study. Now, this could just be a symptom of the government's general neglect of the arts and humanities, but I think it's equally likely to indicate that opening up access to classics is regarded as dangerous, either because it gives access to cachet and privilege in terms of employment, extending this to outsiders, and or because it teaches critical thinking. The underlying assumption by government, I think, is that critical thinking ought to be confined to the safe, i.e. compliant classes and to decision makers. I would also add to this that study of Greek and Roman antiquity might, in a time of culture wars, increasingly be perceived as dangerous, because its current research, teaching, and public engagement trends make it a site for understanding and debate about the nature and legacies of the past and how they are to be faced up to and handled in the present. So paradoxically, study of Greece and Rome is becoming what might be called a subaltern activity. There are many advantages to this disconnection of classical study from the new cultural hegemony. For instance, study of Greek and Roman antiquity and its reception and appropriation presents a microcosm of the problem of how to address the past without erasing it, and how to use awareness of it in order to set current and future priorities. Making sure that the past, including the exploitation of Greek and Roman culture in situations of class, gender, and colonizing oppression, and including the ancient societies themselves. Unless this is openly investigated, it cannot and won't inform and shape priorities for social action in the present, including restorative justice. In summary, this situation has been well summarized by the Post-Classicism's collective. Those of you who've got the handout, it's passage 5 on the handout. And I quote, "If the study of classics, especially since the Renaissance, has been repeatedly motivated by the ideas, first, that ancient Greek and Roman classical texts and materials hold intrinsic value, and second, that Western culture has found a privileged genealogy in the ancient Greek and Roman past, how should the contemporary study of antiquity be structured if neither of these ideological commitments can any longer be expected to be upheld or promoted in an unchallenged manner, both because the structural supports of classicism have changed and because of the dismantling of many of these traditional supports is a good thing that we continue to advocate." Now that's an astringent summary, and it draws attention to two things that need further investigation. The first is what is meant by intrinsic value. The second is the dismantling of the traditional supports for the status of classical study and the implications for the headline topic of this workshop. What might be put in their place? Now, I'll have a shot at saying what these two things imply for me. Terms like intrinsic value have been used as a shield to mask what are actually socially constructed notions of exceptionality, implicit in Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital. I'd want to argue that the value of Greek and Roman texts, materials, and ideas lies in their range and their openness to multiple kinds of interpretation and use. They resist the totalized appropriation. Now, it's true that some aspects of ancient culture have been appropriated in objectionable causes. For example, the iconic status of Spartan education in Nazi Germany has been acutely researched by Helen Roche, Jan Nellis, and others. But most Greek and Roman texts are protean. They resist totalizing interpretation or appropriation. Greek plays, for instance, have provided a major site for the empire to write back. You can see, for example, some of the references in the bibliography on the handout, the essays in Classics in Post-Colonial World, the ongoing work of Emily Greenwood and Barbara Goff. Modern performances of Greek tragedy, for example, provide a theatre of witness. Epic poetry, Greek and Roman, not only inspires subsequent writers, but also provides debates about the nature of power, war, masculinity, trauma, journeys, nostalgia. I could obviously devote the whole of the rest of this lecture to discussing some of those, but I'm not going to, because there's already a very extensive literature. Instead, I want to look at my assumption a bit more critically. If what I've just said about the value of studying antiquity implies a further construction of exceptionality, I think I would plead that at least this one is based on openness to constant critique and re-evaluation, which I would also argue is an essential component of a democratic way of life. I prefer to call this distinctive potential rather than exceptionality. It's evident in the shift that has taken place in attitudes to exemplarity. Two quotes from a volume of essays focusing on temporalities and perceptions of the exemplary function of classical texts and ideas make the point. These are passages 3 and 4 on your handout. Passage 3 is an extract from an essay by Gretlein. And he says, I quote, "While the exemplary use of the past has not completely vanished in the modern age, the uniqueness of epochs makes direct juxtapositions of different events rather problematic. And if such juxtapositions want to claim some plausibility, they have to take into account and weigh the cultural setting of the events that are compared with one another." Passage 4 is a comment on Grethlein's essay. It's by Alica Leoneri in her introduction to that particular volume. And she wrote, and I quote, "Gretlein explores how the two historians, that is Herodotus and Thucydides, break with other commemorative genres by deploying exemplar for critical rather than legitimizing or glorifying purposes, and by introducing into their narratives forms of action that challenge the temporalities of exemplary historiography." And she goes on, "By contrast, the modern critique of exemplary history expressed the feeling that the future is open and can be shaped, while contingency had to be construed not so much as chance, but rather as freedom to act." And that's an important cultural shift. Although, as we will all know, there are many who still like to bring up examples from the Greek and Roman past as something to be emulated in some sense. Now, in addition, the Post-Classicism's collective, in the extract that I read previously, referred to the dismantling of the traditional supports for the status of classical studies. I've already referred to some of the most obvious of these in changes in the education system and in the changing attitudes to the aims and purposes of education. I'd like to add a couple of details. First of all, we shouldn't underestimate the time lag between change at the top and public perceptions. This is another instance of what I would call democratic deficit. Here's a recent example. It was reported, whether or not this is accurate, I do not know, so take it as a hypothesis. It was reported that the current UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, welcomed being seen as a Periclean figure. Now, in the mind of the public mind, Pericles, if the name's recognized at all, is still associated with the acme of the Athenian democracy and the exercise of the archy over other polis. So it's an example of transferability of notions of cultural and political hegemony. The association between Johnson and Pericles was touted in the knowledge that public perceptions of Pericles were extremely unlikely to include knowledge of his background as a member of an aristocratic family engaged in power struggles with other aristocrats, a family which had married outside the Athenian citizen body, which was engaged in a struggle for power. There also, the general public is quite unlikely to know about the verdict of Thucydides in Book 2, that although the Athens of the 5th century BCE was notionally a democracy, under Pericles, it was actually government by one man. And the associations of all that, as expressed in the Epitaphios, are something that Mirko brought to our attention again this morning. Now, the association between Johnson and Pericles, I think, represented an example of the hidden curriculum, in which only a few would have knowledge about what was implicit in the claim of being a modern-day Pericles, whereas the rest could be hoodwinked by the strapline of unexamined cultural associations. It's a question of coded signals, if you like. A coded signal in one direction, you know, that here was somebody Pericles celebrated as a leader of empire and domination over other states, and then the underlying link not known to many, that Pericles has succeeded very well in pursuing his ambitions by acting as a demagogue towards the general public. This question of the idea of Pericles as the idea of the democratic leader still lingers as a kind of cultural talisman. You could think also, for example, of the notion of Homer as a poet of war, which does scant justice to the Iliad. And there is use of figures from Greek and Roman myth and history in popular culture, which are sometimes used as icons for white supremacy and misogyny. Therefore, I think it must be a basic tenet of attempts to democratize learning, teaching, and public engagement about Greek and Roman antiquity, that this time lag is taken account of. The exploitation of Greek and Roman antiquity to serve the cultural hegemony desired by the power elite may have faded, but paradoxically, this has led to a loss of opportunity for internal and external critique by a larger and more socially and culturally varied cohort of people well versed in antiquity. Two more of the extracts on your handout, numbers 1 and 2, address some aspects of this. The first is a quote from something I wrote a few years ago when discussing problems about the so-called democratic turn. And the second is a quote from Kathleen Harlow's very thoughtful analysis in the same volume. I'll read them both in succession. My own first. To fully substantiate a claim, that is, of a democratic turn, it will be necessary to provide convincing evidence under at least 4 main categories: conceptual coherence and validity of the terms used, significant and sustained mass of democratically orientated content and practice in receptions of Greek and Roman material, shifts in scholarly practices, both in the subject matter of research and in the uses to which it is put, shifts in public perceptions of antiquity, increased public awareness of and engagement with Greek and Roman antiquity. And Catherine Harlow put, I think, a very valuable point into this discussion about democracy. She wrote, "Stories about the classical past continue to shape contemporary cultural, political, and social ideas and practices. Consequently, there is a role for critical questioning of those stories. A democratic researcher ought to be committed to using his or her authority to complicate those stories, widen their cast of characters, and open up debates over their meaning rather than to close them down." Now, Catherine Harlow's point about different kinds of narrative to put alongside and challenge the traditionally hegemonic ones is reflected in important recent and ongoing research, notably in fugitive studies, discourses surrounding nomadology, travel and frontiers, border theory, and colonially imposed difference in which local and metropolitan meet head on. All these themes were discussed by Emily Greenwood in her recent paper for the Herodotus Helpline Seminar, and find fruitful material in ancient texts and their receptions. Alongside this change of focus, it's also necessary to note that the notions of a working class that were current in the 19th century and much of the 20th have largely been superseded. The destruction of traditional heavy industries, such as coal mining, also involved the destruction of communities and the senses of social solidarity that held them together. Recent research in this area includes Robert Gildear's investigation of the effects of the breakdown of social filaments, support groups, etc., following the miners' strikes in Britain in 1984-5 and the destruction of the industry by Margaret Thatcher. Modern societies now reflect this sea change, this post-industrial situation, if you like, and a new precariat is evident. Precarious in terms of work, living conditions, opportunities, and sense of belonging. So class exclusions are now different. The concept of class itself has become more fuzzy. This has implications for the role and impact of the different kinds of intellectuals envisaged by Gramsci. It also has implications, I think, for how we respond to Marx's consideration about the oppressed, who actually now are the oppressed. So to pursue this a bit more, I want to point to a couple of very different but useful comparanda. I echo Emily Greenwood's view that comparanda are important in doing what she describes as rearranging the discipline and pushing back boundaries. They also serve to emphasize that collaborative work is vital, with its willingness to share insights, to listen to one another, and to ask for help from people who have got expertise in adjacent areas that are actually relevant to the work that individuals are trying to do. My first point of comparison is with the labour history and working class histories of Britain, the second from post-colonial studies. These overlap in interesting ways. We heard this morning about the outstanding research work that's been presented and published by Edith Hall, Henry Stead, and their colleagues in the Classics and Class project. It has its own part in the agenda of this workshop, so I've just included references in the bibliography. But there are just 2 points I want to make in connection with that. Firstly, Stead and Hall have shown that there is a rich hinterland of working class engagements with Greece and Rome that went far beyond the desire of the autodidacts to gain the knowledge and expertise denied them by the social and economic ring fences that excluded them from education. But the effects of self-directed learning and of popular engagement with stories from myth and drama were by no means always necessarily radical, let alone politically transformative. I contribute an essay to one of their volumes which addressed the assimilative and gradualist aspects of that. Again, in listening to the paper this morning on 5th century Athens, it's very clear that the working class can be just as xenophobic and misogynist as anybody else. And that's not necessarily incompatible with being subaltern and resistant. My second gadfly point, if you like, is from some work that's been done in post-colonial studies. In her incisive study of anti-colonial resistance, Priyamvada Gopal provides several touching points relevant to the need for the different overarching narratives to which Harlow alluded, although Greek and Roman material does not figure in Gopal's study. First quote from her work, it's passage number 11 on your handout, invokes Adorno's spur to work seriously on the past. This seems to me to provide a metaphor for what is necessary in terms of constructing a new narrative for classical studies, and at the same time to locate the task as a responsibility the agency of the marginalized people, as well as for the hitherto privileged. One of the most valuable aspects of Gopal's book is her insistence that colonized people influenced awareness and right decision-making at the center of the empire. They were not victims, but agents in making the future. And here's my quote from her book, which was published in 2020, now in paperback. In the British Isles, she writes, the project of developing a more demanding relationship to history than is offered by prevalent island stories goes beyond the performative largesse of including ethnic and cultural minorities in the national. What Adorno calls seriously working upon the past is a task that has also to be taken on by Britain's African, Caribbean, and Asian communities. What might be the resonances for those communities of reflecting on a history of agency and resistance, of the colonized in struggle in terms of developing a different relationship to both Britain and the world? Now, this conjunction between working on the past and creating the future seems to me to avoid the patronizing undertones that might associate Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual with the intellectual's task of speaking on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. Gopal's insight also helps to overcome some of the associations of the alienated intellectual who becomes cut off from his or her roots. There's in the poetry of Tony Harrison a thread that acknowledges regretfully that process of alienation set in motion by education, specifically in classics. There are quotes from Harrison on your handout, passages number 6 and 7. Here's the first one, which is an extract from the autobiographical section of his prose essay, Facing Up to the Muses. And he wrote, I was born into an uneducated working class family in Leeds. And at the age of 11, I won one of those scholarships created by the Education Act of 1944 to Leeds Grammar School, where as scholarship boys, we were considered bright, if nothing else. I was set automatically, it seems to me now, to study the classics. I had family who were afflicted with a metaphorical dumbness and lack of socially confident articulation. So already the opportunity to expand his own knowledge and understanding was distancing himself from his family and local environments. And he addressed that in a poem called Classic Society, in which he wrote, we boys can take old Hansard and translate the British Empire into SPQR, but nothing demotic or too up to date, and not the English that I speak at home. Harrison's experience of alienation made him even more determined that his creative work in poetry, drama, and film would transform, even revolutionize, understanding of political action. His focus in his film poem, Prometheus, on the relationship between poetry, knowledge, and fire, epitomizes that determination. Passage 8 on your handout provides a poetic correspondence to Gopal's discussion of Adorno and working on the past. Harrison wrote in his author's preface to the text of his film poem, Prometheus, the fire that primitive man gazes into and that prompts him in his flame-lit reverie to become a poet is one thing. The fire we are forced to gaze into as we cross millennia at the end of the 20th century is another. The fire we must gaze into burns in Dresden, Hamburg, in the ovens of Auschwitz, in Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Now you can find an alternative approach to Harrison's passion and urgency in Seamus Heaney's use of the image of the creative flame, which is passage number 9 on your handout. Heaney's famous line, whatever you say nothing, invoked a real situation of risk in an island that was of his youth, which was working to liberate itself from British ascendancy. Heaney's poetic image of a balancing of the buckets, one in each hand, as he walked across a farmyard, not only invokes his early experiences of agricultural work on his father's farm, it also acts as a metaphor for the balancing act that he saw as the role of the poet in the Troubles in the north of Ireland in the last years of the 20th century. And he wrote in a prose essay, passage 9 on the handout, to be a source of truth and at the same time a vehicle of harmony, this expresses what we would like poetry to be. And it takes me back to the kinds of pressure that poets from Northern Ireland are subject to. These poets feel with a special force a need to be true to the negative nature of the evidence, and at the same time, the need to show an affirming flame, the need to be both socially responsible and creatively free. Now, both Tony Harrison and Seamus Heaney had classical education that opened up their future careers. Both were, I suppose, potentially organic intellectuals, for whom classical text and reference were a major cultural and poetic inspiration and provided a site for working out their aspirations as poets and as commentators. But, as you've seen from the quotes that I've read, their creative practices and public stance took this in very different directions. Finally, I'd like to look briefly at future possibilities. I've emphasized several aspects of coming to terms with the past or pasts, including the hankering after various kinds of past, whether they be social, educational, ethical, epistemological. And I want to suggest that in the notion of nostalgia and its energization of futures, we might find a way forward for the issues that we face. One way forward emerges from the history of our own subject area. The notion of nostalgia is a foundational one, from the Odyssey onwards through the literature of exile to insights from psychology and memory studies. In her recently published book, Imagining Ithaca, Nostos and Nostalgia Since the Great War, Kathleen Riley traces how nostalgia is conceived in literature, society, and in the emotions and actions of ordinary people. She points out the origins of the concept long before it was pathologized by scientists, and writes, the words nostos and algos occur in close proximity within a description of homesickness entirely consistent with our modern understanding of nostalgia as a meaningful emotional state. She points out that Odysseus's emotional state in Odyssey 5 is one aspect of how his nostalgia is presented in the poem as a whole, as a deeply existential state. Odysseus's nostalgia for his home, for his own place, for his situation in family and community, of his status in the world, are all facets of his sense of identity. Yet pain and suffering caused by this sense of loss need not be totally destructive. And Catherine Riley moves to Cavafy for an illustration. This is passage number 13 on your handout, and I quote, at its most faithfully Odyssean, nostalgia is forward-looking, anticipatory. It is how the human imagination in exile sustains itself and draws inspiration from displacement. It is a vision, a sentiment that chimes with Cavafy's counsel to keep Ithaca always in your mind and never to fear Lastrygonian, Cyclops, or Poseidon's wrath, as long as you keep your thoughts raised high, as long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. That's Riley quoting Cavafy. Now you can find a comparable insight in Derek Walcott's poem Omeros, in which the central figure, Achille, returns in his imagination to his African roots to find that his name is not recognized and he cannot reintegrate. Yet this African catabasis is not destructive. It also leads to perceptions of an alternative future that is not destroyed by awareness of the past. an alternative future that carries its memory, but does not end with it. And there's a brief extract, which is item 10 on your handout. Walcott wrote, "The sadness sank into him slowly that he was at home. That dawn sadness that ghosts have for their graves, because the future reversed itself in him. He was his own memory." For another slant on the relationship between pasts and presents that addresses the specifics of the situation in classical studies, here's a quote from Brooke Holmes's essay on cosmopoiesis. It's extract number 12 on your handout. And I quote, "The building of worlds that bring sometimes unusual constellations of ancient text together with live elements in the present in creative symbiosis. The work is necessary, processual, partial, and contingent, qualities integral to what the work of cosmopoiesis in the field of the classical contributes to the work of living together and living well." Holmes points to an element that is becoming more prominent in the work that classical studies scholars and students do, a commitment to an ethical engagement with the wider world that redefines what can be contributed from study of antiquity and its reception. There was a recent example in Jennifer Wallace's Classics and Literature lecture, given at the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama in Oxford in April of this year, and based on her book, Tragedy Since 9/11, Reading a World Out of Joint. Wallace's main argument was that literary criticism should be reinvested with ethical, political, and moral relevance. She commented on Greek tragedy and its adaptation in modern context as a mode of witness that makes contemporary crises intelligible. Wallace emphasized the role of ancient texts in making these connections. Vehicles for this include narratives and myth, points of recognition, and the performative of witness. In conclusion, in this short series of comments, I've suggested that Gramsci's notions of cultural hegemony and categorization of types of intellectual make a good starting point for considering the current situation of our field of classics and the study of Greek and Roman antiquity. However, the changing context of contemporary society and its intellectual priorities, as well as the changing context for the sphere of classics, do point to the need for looking at these from a different perspective and in the light of different questions. Familiarity with Greek and Roman antiquity is no longer at the core of the cultural hegemony exercised and controlled by the ruling elite. Although there is still a residue of cultural icons originating in antiquity, these are often simplified stereotypes ripe for exploitation in popular media. In the wider public imagination, perceptions of ancient Greece and Rome oscillate between, on the one hand, holding an outdated cachet as the epitome of excellence and authority, and on the other hand, yielding icons for ethical, cultural, and gender exploitation, including by the hard right. The icons that remain are not, in general, those that stimulate the deliberative and critical insights that are necessary for a mature democratic society. Correspondingly, education in classical subjects has been marginalized and is regarded, again paradoxically, as either the preserve of certain schools and universities or as useless in terms of employment and economic priorities. In addition, the histories of appropriation of Greek and Roman antiquity in the service of imperial and colonial projects have discredited the whole field of study in the eyes both of the liberal intelligentsia and of the people who've been marginalized and oppressed on account of their gender, race, and class. There are, of course, exceptions to my generalization, but I think it would hold sway as a shorthand. However, this apparently unhappy situation does have some redeeming aspects. First of all, antiquity has been liberated from its co-option by the predominant cultural hegemony. This allows the creation of new spaces for development and debate within the subject and beyond. The challenge posed by Gramsci about how cultural hegemonies might be challenged and redrawn to create a new kind of public imagination that is both reflexive and aspirational does, of course, remain. Nevertheless, the fact that classical study has been forced into a position in which it is no longer dominant, it is itself subaltern, is potentially a source of strength. Gopal's model, in which the marginalized and colonized can use resistance and constructive dissent to energize change and transform attitudes among the powerful, provides us all with an analogy. Now, this process will demand leadership from intellectuals at all levels, intellectuals who remain organic in the sense that they can confront possible alienation and turn it to advantage, maintaining and strengthening links with their original communities, but also moving out and beyond in order to re-empower them. I've suggested that the concept of nostalgia, so important in classical texts and their reception, need not be destructive in limiting vision to the regaining of a past that is unattainable, but can provide a gateway to the future, opening the way for cultural imaginaries to inspire and to make a different future. Some of the future discussion in this workshop will be focused on how this can be achieved in the sphere of classical studies. I've suggested that in its engagement with the past, classical study and its outreach into the public imagination offers a microcosm of the struggles in post-colonial and post-traumatic societies in general. So I would hope that in working for this in our own field, we could also make a contribution to the similar and urgent needs of wider society, both nationally and globally. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so very much for this extremely thought-provoking reflection upon what has been done and where we may go. I'm opening the field for questions. I think you can either write them on the chat or you can raise a hand, I think, and I can enable to speak. Well, maybe I can ask a question to break the ice, perhaps in the meantime. I really enjoyed this. There are a number of things that I've been thinking about. There is, of course, a real paradox, right, in making subaltern voices speak. I guess one of the names that I kept thinking in my head was that of Gayatri Spivak and her famous article on Can the Subaltern Speak, and her use of the German Darstellen as something which is both representing and so making someone another, but also speaking on behalf of, which is something that I think you touched upon in the problem of, you know, change only coming by intellectuals who, you know, have to be traditional intellectuals, even if classics is becoming subaltern in its sense. So, I mean, I guess that is a challenge in itself, right? How to, people who can't speak don't speak, and when they speak, they're no longer subaltern. And I mean, I was thinking about your quote from Derek Walcott as well. There is a lot, I think, in Derek Walcott's work itself in reflection of how he himself poses himself and his various selves, especially in Omeros, towards other subaltern identities, and Helen herself as being a native and being a woman, and being a mirage, right, throughout Omeros as the image of, you know, those who cannot speak. So I think this is the major bottleneck, in a sense, the major obstacle that we are facing, right, in our futures. And I very much like your way of using nostalgia to overcome it, but I also wonder to what extent is nostalgia also necessarily anchored to the past or to a sort of tradition. And what are the problems about using that image?
Yeah, I take the point. I think I would really want to use the nostalgia analogy in quite a provocative way, because it seems to me, looking at the themes that were particularly engaged with in this workshop, that we actually, in recognizing the past and its dynamics and the problems that remain, we have to take note of that, but without falling into a nostalgic attitude about, for example, the kind of discipline that classics used to have and the authority it used to have, which, you know, historical investigation shows us was a social political construct anyway. And equally that we can't be nostalgic or take forward a closed nostalgic vision about what it is to be a working class person engaged in manual labor, because much of that framework has been shattered, and I mean with it, you know, a loss of the kind of social solidarity that actually led to action, the kinds of social institutions, you know, that fostered it. And one of the very interesting things, I think, is that if we're thinking about who is now oppressed, that is not coterminous with a lack of education, although it may be. But some of the people whose livelihoods and whose very social existence is now the most precarious are actually well-educated people. So we've got a paradoxical situation in which captains of industry and so on boast that they never went to university and are not, you know, interested in the arts, etc., etc. And the people who are the most oppressed in terms of having no work or insecure work or 0 hours contracts or terrible housing and that are very often quite well educated. And I mean, I do think that this extends also into our own profession. I mean, we all know that many of our colleagues who've entered the profession more recently are on very short-term contracts, are eking out their postgraduate studies without being able to take on, you know, the kind of part-time work which used to be possible, and so on. So there is, you know, quite an interesting overlap, and I hope that actually some of the insights from their practical experience that some of our younger and newer colleagues have got will actually help to shape and inform the future of how you know, the study of antiquity and its reception can actually reach out in a much more deeply embedded way into society as a whole. And I think the kinds of things which both workshops like this one and also other particular groups in our subject area, kind of things that they can do to actually support our early career colleagues, you know, in keeping going, but not losing sight of what it is that they and their friends have had to go through, is going to be extremely important. So it's different kinds of solidarity that I think are going to be important, and multiple solidarities. I mean, nobody has an identity which is just confined to being a classicist or an ancient historian. We've got multiple identities. And going back to what you were saying, Eleanor, and we all have to become multilinguists. And I mean that not only in terms of the variety of languages that we're sort of able to understand in academic terms, but also in terms of the ways in which we can think and express ourselves and so on. Mona Baker, the translation scholar, has got a very, very interesting project, huge project, on the genealogies of knowledge. And she has touched on some of those issues, though not with reference to classical material. And again, I think you know, students of antiquity have got a huge contribution to make in those fields. Difficult, I know, because time is limited. You know, is it Kenneth Dover who said that actually there was a limit to the number of languages even he could learn, which I found quite reassuring. But we have to try and do it. And one of the really unexpected benefits of this awful COVID situation is that I do think that a lot of our workshops and symposia are much more internationally interactive than they were when we were depending on people having, the time and the resource to travel across the world and so on. And that's something I think we need to, to keep hold of and take into the future.
Thank you so much. Yeah, because I've been taking for granted the whole situation with universities for so long that I really appreciate the idea of using it as a positive push towards the future and to create solidarity across similar contexts as well. I have a question for sure from Henry. I think that's the only one I see.
Thank you, Elena. And thank you, Lorna, for a wonderfully thoughtful and thought-provoking paper. I wonder if, would you, you mentioned that you'd written about in the Stray Festschrift about identity scholarship. And I just wondered, I think you mentioned it being you made a kind of cautious point or cautionary point. And I just wonder if you would, explain a bit more about what you mean, why there might have to be, or maybe not have to be, but why you predict that there will be this kind of identitarian or identity scholarship at play.
It was in a section of my chapter for that volume where I was actually talking about the kinds of questions that researchers want to ask and how they frame them, which of course, affect some of the judgments that one makes then about the evidence. And I was trying to really just provoke some thought about the implications of the kinds of questions which are formulated as a result of people's lived experience, partly expressed in personal voice scholarship, but also expressed in more recent examinations of the relationship between ancient and modern slavery, for example, and a whole host of other things. And what I was wanting to say was that while the impetus for those kinds of questions is very often going to be the result of people's personal experience, their own heritage, and so on, it's vitally important that we don't fall into a position of saying that it is only people from a particular kind of heritage, or only women, for example, who can, write about misogyny in the ancient texts and so on, because actually those are questions for us all. And unless we're prepared to listen to one another and talk to one another, those areas are going to be marginalized. They're not going to become part of the core, the fabric, the understanding of what it is that the study of antiquity can actually contribute in the wider world. I'm very keen that classics and classical studies shouldn't sort of retreat into a kind of Largo, circle the wagons, as it were, and say that we are under pressure and so on. We have got to defend the core, etc., etc. We actually have got a huge amount to contribute to wider debate, both in academic sense, related disciplines, but also through public engagement and the many social problems that the world faces. For example, and the example that I pursued a little bit in the essay that you referred to was about engaging with the past and with the awfulness of the past. There's rightly now a huge amount of public discussion about a removal of statues and so on and so forth. And classics is almost a microcosm of how you balance the need not to repress the awfulness of the past with a need to understand it and to explain it, and a need also to think how that understanding, that explanation, does not erase the past, but does open the way to a more constructive future. And one of the advantages of the area in which we work is that it is, although it's part of the present and so on, it is also sufficiently distanced from the present to enable people to ask extremely challenging and difficult and potentially offensive questions, and to pursue in a very collaborative way how we might engage with them. And I do think that's one of the great strengths of our discipline, and something that we can actually put at the service of the wider public, which is a bit what the kind of thing I had in mind when I was talking about how one could be a cultural imaginary. Well, I mean, I can't, because I'm a belt and braces person and I plod along, but some of you people are going to go on and do that kind of thing. And I think it's really important that we support you in asking the impossible and getting on with it.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add a small thing that I completely agree with you. The problems with the essentialism work also both ways, because even for marginalized people, like expecting that because you're a woman, you would engage.
Exactly.
And if you're from a minority.
Exactly. I mean, for years and years, I was, I don't know, the statutory woman on every university committee. I mean, that's awful, you know. And I was, you know, I got to the point where, you know, the chair would sort of patronize and say, oh, well, Lorna, you know, as a woman, do you this, that, and the other. I just wanted to throw something. But you had to sit there and be there, because by having a presence, you were actually opening up to the people, for things for the people who came afterwards. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's an awful balancing act.
Yeah. I have a question from Emilio.
Yeah.
And if there are any more questions, you can also send me a message and I'll just raise a hand.
Thank you, and thank you, Lorna. This was fantastic. I have so many ideas, I don't know where to start, but I think I'll just focus on a few of the last comments to kind of make a liaison, a link to a general question. So you were talking, you mentioned the issues concerning statues, so public memory and the construction of the cultural hegemony of the time and the construction of a certain cultural milieu in which any phenomenon takes signification, basically. And I find that in our field, in different contexts, for instance, in our context of origin, Italy, there's a strong reaction and a strong reactionary attitude, which is for some good reasons, among which age, basically, and hierarchy, is the only voice considered in mainstream discourse. While we do these sort of events and take the space to discuss, there's a world outside of the practitioners, which is just, you know, replicating old structures of power. And I really love your idea that the antiquity might be now liberated by the co-option of the dominant cultural hegemony, and so it can become a locus of resistance. Is something that I feel particularly close to my heart. And the next question, however, would be how to be public intellectuals, how to take our voices, and you know, let them hear what we have to say, even if we are junior scholars, for instance. And because I think in the end that we are facing a period of transition, a sort of paradigmatic crisis and reorganization of this discipline, but not only this discipline, most of the humanities. And this is, as every crisis, including cultural crisis, is a very productive and potentially revolutionary moment. So the question, I'm afraid, is a bit boring and obvious, but is, what do we do?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Can I make suggestions sort of at opposite ends of the abstraction spectrum? The first thing that I actually believe passionately is that when it is often said that the job of intellectuals is actually to make complex ideas simple and put them across. Now, yeah, okay, obviously lucidity is very important. And as I've said, we need to be able to speak in a number of different languages, in quotes. But I think it is equally important, and in the current situation, probably even more so, for intellectuals, scholars to show that simple ideas are actually much more complex, that they are embedded in a whole system of assumptions and associations and so on. Now, the different ways in which people can do that, according to whether they're teaching, whether they're giving talks, whether they're engaging with the media, and I can't do that. I don't have that facility, and I really admire people who can do it and who've got the courage to do it. But I think it is incredibly important, and that is very different from being the standard person who is asked to pronounce on some social issue that actually they don't know any more about than the average member of the general public. So without sort of falling into the stereotype of saying, oh, it's not my field, which we all sort of know, we have to somehow sort of walk that tightrope of trying to talk lucidly about the things that we actually do know about in such a way that people can grasp the essentials, but also be aware that there is a whole sort of root system and network of complications. So that's my abstract way of looking at it. And you very rightly asked about the practicalities. As far as getting people involved in Greek and Roman material is concerned, I mean, participation is the best way, isn't it? And there is a lot of wonderful work being done at the moment on street theatre, though it's been slightly interrupted by COVID, but I mean, it will come back, on other kinds of participatory work. And I mean, I'm thinking here of the relationship, to the kind of work that's been advocated by Paulo Freire, that's been done by Zeki Zonda in South Africa, not necessarily predominantly classically orientated, but is involved with community theatre, with their exploration of possibilities and so on. And we have the most marvelous material from Greece and Rome, that enables that. And some of the kind of work that Helen Eastman has been doing, for instance, with her YouTube, versions of key scenes from Greek drama. I mean, the wonderful sequence that she put on YouTube from the Watchman's speech from the beginning of the Agamemnon in Greek, but with subtitles and experience. There are masses of ways in which it can be done. Some of you know a great deal more about all of that than I do. I mean, Henry, I know you've been on one of the AHRC public engagement, initiatives, haven't you? And I think people are going to have to be very imaginative, and I hope that universities, which are beginning to recognize this as part of people's job descriptions and workload calculations, will actually give increased increased space for that. I mean, it is a whole area of expertise. I mean, there's a whole range of new technology to be exploited. Some people do it individually very successfully, but I would also like the subject networks, to be able to do that. So that's one thing. And then there's the other question, which I sort of hinted at, which is slightly the elephant in the room, is we're talking about all this on the basis that, or the assumption that if people engage with texts and ideas and material culture of antiquity and so on, they're somehow going to become more enlightened and so on. And I'm quite purist on this. I think if you give people the tools, as it were, and help them to think critically, you have to accept that some of them are going to come out with judgments, and I don't mean just judgments in the scholarly sense, I mean social values and so on, that are not what one would have hoped for. And that actually, to me, is part of our subject field operating in a democratic way, so that people are coming to judgments on the basis of actually having considered evidence and implications and so on. And that is just opening up agency. And if you are cautious about that, you're doing a sort of reverse thing of Thucydides, you know, who says, oh yes, democracy is okay as long as it's in the hands of the right people, you know, and not at the mob. But I think part of our job is to make sure that the mob is as critically informed and thoughtful as we can possibly facilitate. And then you have to stand back and let people get on with it. Last time I said that, I was nearly lynched, but as I'm sitting behind the computer at home in rural Gloucestershire, I can say. But it is. I mean, it is a test, isn't it? You know, of our good faith, if you like.
I think as Emilio was asking his question, there was a question from Natasha, which I think you've just answered. So she thanks you for your wonderful talk, and she asks, how can we in academia actively and practically?
Just going on from that, I think it is.
Yeah, I don't know if Natasha, you want
people exchange ideas and practices of experience. You know, and we've got people in this workshop from a whole range of different countries, you know, social situations and so on. And if people can actually exchange their ideas, you know, that is great. And the other thing which I didn't mention actually is, I mean, doing this is not a sort of completely altruistic thing, because the benefits to the individual scholar or group of scholars are absolutely huge. I mean, I would say that virtually all the main research questions that I've been working on for the last 30 years or what have you have actually originated in discussions with students, because I taught for many years in the Open University, in which, you know, people didn't require entrance qualifications and came from all sorts of backgrounds. So that in one seminar you would find people who were extraordinarily well read and other people who were just making their first acquaintance with Homer that they vaguely heard of but didn't know anything, and actually getting that kind of mutual engagement and questioning, in which nothing could be taken for granted, did open up for me the possibility of asking research questions that were not exactly mainstream at the time, though they may be more so now.
Do you find, if I can ask a question, do you find that this danger that you've spoken about people coming up with different solutions, different interpretations that we may not like as well, is kind of part of, you know, what lies in the danger of also applying a deconstructive method, which is inherent in many of the theorization of classical.
We're all subject to it, aren't we? Yes, of course, as an individual, I occasionally throw out my hands in horror and say, well, why did I spend all those hours helping somebody to do something where they're going to use it like that, you know? But that's part of what we're about, you know, that just as the ancient texts have this capacity to you know, to make debate, to throw out a number of areas of possible meaning that sometimes get repressed and then re-emerge and so on. And I think working with material which after all is centuries old and has, you know, been through a number of mediations before it gets anywhere near where we are, actually does help you get a sense of perspective on that.
I very much liked your example of Pericles for Boris Johnson, but one example that I was thinking about that is a famous one in this respect, I think, is the one of the 9/11 memorial, using, you know, that line from Virgil, no day shall erase you for the memory of time, which when you go back and look at the context sounds much more as if it was applicable to the terrorists instead. And I guess that, you know, as literary critics, we sort of accept that, you know, the shift in meanings of, I mean, that is the way that I read literature, but obviously that means that it's open to exploitation from all sorts of angle and interpretation. So,
but nobody's ever done anything worthwhile that hasn't been dangerous. I mean, that's one reason I'm suggesting that the powers that be are actually not very keen for classical education in its fullest sense to be extended beyond the favoured few.
Right. Are there any more questions that Natasha, I'm imagining that Lorna has just expressed that.
Yes, thank you very much.
You'd like to add something?
Thank you so much.
If I think on the handout, I think I probably did put my email address. So if there are, you know, things that occur to people subsequently or things you want to argue with or what have you, you know, please do email me and I'll, you know, try and get back to you.
And thank you so much for giving us such a full handout, which is really very, very useful. And I think we'll go back to it to think about many of these issues. So I'll close it here, and I thank Lorna very much, and I thank the organizers as well. I think I understand this is the end of the day, right? So yeah, thank you so much for everyone.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Bye, and all have a good evening.